When it comes to our understanding of the Old Testament, it's often we can think of it in the context of all of the dark passages, the ones that often scare us away. But we often don't realize that underlying all of this is a great picture of the glory of God and His desire to have a relationship with us, to have us to lift our heads, to receive His presence and to shine His face upon us. He is a God who loves and cares for us, and that is the God that is fundamentally behind everything that is written in the Old Testament. If we don't take the time to talk about it, we'll probably not see it in light of some of the darker shadows. But that's why I'm being privileged to be joined today by Dr. Stephen B. Chapman, who is the author behind a series called Touchstone Text. And in them, he has a book called The Lord Bless You, the number 6 for the life of the church. It's a priestly blessing that I'm excited to dive into today. So, Dr. Chapman, thank you for being a part of the many voices for that one message.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's just a delight for me to be here. And one small fine tuning. I'm not actually the author of every book in the series.
Well, the
I'm
edit,
the editor of the series.
yeah,
One of the things that's really nice about the series is that there are a number of superbly qualified biblical scholars who are trying to make the fruits of their research available to a wider public. And so I've been just terribly pleased to be able to be a part of that and to help them do that. And then I wrote one volume myself, which is a new volume on the priestly blessing in number 6.
tell us a little bit about that in your background. You're a professor of divinity at, or the Old Testament at the Duke Divinity. So tell us a little bit about your passion for areas of the Bible that a lot of us don't dive into very often.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. And I'm so grateful for your introduction about the Old Testament. I've been at Duke Divinity School now for 25 years. I regularly teach our standard introductory course to the Old Testament, which is a 2 semester sequence. So I get a whole year to take people through the Old Testament, which is one of my very favorite things to do. But I've noticed, and I often kind of joke about it, that if there's one thing people know about the Old Testament as they come into the class, it's that the Old Testament is a problem,
Mm.
right? And I think there are problems and there are challenges, but there's a way in which sometimes they get so much attention that we're not alert to the beauty of the Old Testament and the way in which grace is on offer from the triune God throughout the Bible, and that includes the Old Testament as well as the New. And that's really what fuels my own research, my own sense of vocation and ministry. Um, I'm a Baptist, so the Bible has always been important to me. And even so, I grew up in church. My dad was a Baptist pastor. Even so, when I got to seminary, I realized that I knew a fair bit about the New Testament and I knew some stuff about Christian theology, but everything seemed to go back to the Old Testament. I just kept getting the sense that this is where it starts. This is the root of everything, and I didn't feel like I knew enough about it. So actually, one of the reasons why I was inclined to do further academic work was to learn about something that I felt like I didn't know enough about. And as I learned, I became positively evangelical about the Old Testament. And I get really excited about trying to share what I see and what I observe in the Old Testament with other folks. I think that the Old Testament has tremendous resources, particularly for thinking about the church today and the status of the church, the role of the church. The Old Testament is just everywhere about the people of God. And if we don't really attend to the Old Testament, I think we're really missing out on some incredible resources for our faith, for theological reflection today.
I think one of the things that challenges us in the Old Testament is that it paints a picture of a real world. We're really suffering from a modern delusion where we don't want to believe that the world could really be this bad and this dark and this corrupt. But the reality is, the Bible depicts a world just like we're seeing today. Just we don't want to acknowledge it.
That's right. And I think there's always been a tendency for readers of the Bible to kind of read the biblical stories with the idea of heroes and villains, or as I say sometimes, it's like the old cowboy movies, white hats and black hats. And um, one thing I just absolutely love about the Old Testament is that the narratives don't really work that way. People are more complicated,
Mm.
and it's amazing to me how much these stories can communicate with sometimes very few words, really, and not a lot of description. But I see myself so often in these Old Testament stories, and I feel these tensions and these contradictions within myself. Frankly, sometimes I have a little bit of a kind of harder time relating to some of the characters, some of the people in the New Testament stories, because they just seem so good. You know, in the Old Testament, I feel like I can really relate to these people, and their struggles. And I do think the Old Testament's very realistic. And when people start to say, well, what about this and what about that? As you just did, I say, well, look around. I mean, this is the world. This is the world we live in.
Mm. The book that you are presenting today is The Lord Bless You, which centers on the priestly prayer here in Numbers 6. It's Moses and giving the instruction from God to Aaron to then bless the people. What is significant about really just three verses here in the book of Numbers that have such weight to the Old Testament?
Well, the priestly blessing is so well known in Christian tradition, particularly today. And as I thought about what volume I might contribute to the Touchstone Text series, I really started to think about doing something on blessing because it seemed to me that it was a very timely topic. And this was 3 or 4 years ago. I frankly think it's only gotten more timely, even over the last month. Um, and and at the same time, although it was such an important biblical topic, it seemed to me it didn't get a lot of attention. you know, Blessing for most of us has just become about a benediction at the end of a worship service. And I think the biblical understanding of blessing is much deeper and wider than that. And the blessing in the Bible is the priestly blessing. And as you say, it's really very short. Um, but we don't always think about the words and what it really means. We're so used to the words, we don't really stop and think about them. Kind of like with the Lord's Prayer. We recite the Lord's Prayer. We don't often sort of break it down and say, what are we really saying? And what are we really talking about? What are we praying? Um, th there's not been the same tradition of reciting the priestly blessing within Christianity, although it's recited regularly in synagogue worship in Judaism. But it's the blessing in the Old Testament. It's really the blessing in the Bible. It's never mentioned explicitly or quoted explicitly in the New Testament, but I think there are various ways in which it's implied, and that the tradition very much continues. It's it's a hugely significant moment in the story of the Pentateuch because it comes at the end of all of the instructions about building the priestly tabernacle and all of the rules about worship, which are really about how to be a people of God. Uh, you know, they have to be able to worship together. It's worship that will sustain them. And so it's the priestly blessing in number 6 is really the capstone to all of the instructions about worship. And it occurs at the point at which the whole Sinai legislation really concludes, and there's a turn in the story of Numbers toward leaving Sinai and going out into the world toward the promised land. So, in its present placement, the priestly blessing is something of a capstone and a conclusion. And it's also, as I put it in the book, a word of traveling mercy. This is a word for Israel as they go out into the world, very much like a benediction at the close of a Christian worship service. But it's very short. They're just a few verses, and these are words that God speaks to Moses for Aaron and his sons to speak before the people.
Mm.
And so he says, Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. The Lord bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha vihuneka. May the Lord's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha vayasem lecha shalom. May the Lord lift up his face upon you and give you peace. And that's it. But it's beautiful. And I think it has a well-deserved place in Christian music. There have been wonderful musical settings. It has a well-deserved place in Christian liturgy. Many churches will use it to conclude a service. I know Christian families that use it in the home to bless their children, which is also a Jewish custom on the Sabbath service in the home. The father of the household will use the priestly blessing to bless the children in the household. And so there are ways in which this blessing remarkably, still has such profound impact in Judaism and Christianity after after thousands of years.
Mm.
I mean, it's really a remarkable thing that these ancient words are still used and that they speak so directly to us of the reality of our faith, our relationship with God, our relationship with Jesus Christ.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned we're not too familiar with blessing. Obviously, in a Jewish context, there was so much about consecration. There was so much about purity, so much about, you mentioned the laws that they were given about of how to worship correctly and how to present themselves in a proper manner. To have this blessing is a means of much more than simply saying, someone sneezes and say, God bless you, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we've kind of inherited a watered down view of blessing. And one of the things I find very powerful, very moving about the biblical tradition is that in the biblical understanding, Old Testament and New Testament, blessing is a word of power. Blessing does something. It's not just nice words that you say about something. I think oftentimes today, people say, "Oh, bless her heart," or something like this. Or blessing becomes just a way of affirming someone. "Oh, bless you," and it's kind of watered down and it loses the power and the focus of the biblical tradition. In the Bible, it's God who blesses, and it's people who say the blessing, but they're invoking the blessing, which is to say the power of God. There's very much a sense that blessing is kind of like a word of prophecy. It's a word of power. It can't be taken back. It changes things.
Mm.
And I would love for us to be able in the church to reclaim something of that understanding and something of that heritage.
You mentioned the importance of the divine name of God. It's repeated multiple times in each of these three verses, but you respectfully choose not to articulate it due to the post-Babylonian tradition. So I want to respect that, but I also want to acknowledge that this is the divine name of God, and it's significant to the context of this blessing.
Absolutely. And it's really important for my interpretation of the blessing. At the beginning of each phrase, each of the three phrases in the traditional interpretation, you find the word Lord. And that's a translational convention that has grown out of Jewish as well as Christian tradition. But in this tradition, you don't pronounce the sacred name, the personal name of God, which is Yahweh. It's a consonantal name. We're not 100% sure of how it was pronounced in ancient Israel, but we have some pretty good guesses. What we have in the biblical text is really just the four consonants or the tetragram, and the vocalization, all the vocalization is later, although it's based on ancient tradition. And so, in other words, it's not just the word God, which is El or Elohim in Hebrew. It's not the generic word for God. It's God's personal name, the name that God reveals to Moses in Exodus. And I find it striking that this is the name used in the priestly blessing. What is even more striking to me is that at the conclusion of the blessing, God then says to Moses, in this way, with this blessing, you will put my name on the people. So this is a kind of interpretation of the blessing, really, and a very interesting one. I mean, here God is saying, when you bless the people, what you are in effect doing is putting my name on them. And it doesn't say to, right? But on. And so, in a variety of ways, I think the understanding here is that when people receive the blessing, they're understood to kind of bear it or even wear it. It's I say in the book, it's this idea of blessing is kind of like a another set of clothes or a second skin. And I think this is related to the idea of going out into the world. When the Israelites go forth into the world, they will be bearing God's name, having received this blessing. They will be wearing, which is to say, there's a link here between blessing and worship and witness. And I think this is also deeply embedded in the New Testament tradition. It's not, I think, a way that most Christians think about this anymore. I really am trying in the book to kind of call attention to this aspect of the biblical tradition, and in a way to try and revive it. I think there's a lot of really good pastoral work that could be done to encourage Christians to think about living out their faith as bearing the name of God, bearing the name of Christ in the world. One scholar talked about how, by virtue of receiving the blessing, the ancient Israelites became themselves with their lives and their words and their deeds and their bodies like shrines to the Lord. And I love that image. And I think it's actually very Pauline too. There's this idea, faith in the Bible is surprisingly physical. And we don't think that way either. But faith is not only about what people do and what they say, it's also about their bodies, right? Um, what they do with their bodies, what they represent with their bodies. Paul talks about this. We bear the death of Christ in our bodies, and our bodies need to reflect the resurrection of Christ, the life of Christ. And I think blessing is all tied up with this idea of name bearing as well. And I think there's a lot of really rich reflection and work that pastors and churches could do to try and reclaim something of this understanding and something of this tradition.
I agree with you. I think we couldn't say enough about the bearing of his name. We see it in the Ten Commandments. It's a central figure that we bear his name, and that's what the rest of the commandments are essentially, is working out of what it means to embody his name as his children, as his people. I also think that one of the ways we have misunderstood it in our modern day is we sort of see it as either an incantation or we see it as a name that we tag at the end as like a zip code to make sure it gets to the right person that we're praying to. But really, this is more like a law enforcement officer who says, "Stop in the name of the law." And he's not saying that he is the law, but he's saying, I have the full authority and the blessing, authority, and power that is given to me through this name.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I talk about this at some length in the book. There's always been a kind of thin line between the notion of blessing and magic. It's made people, blessing has made people uncomfortable. It continues to make people uncomfortable because sometimes they feel like it gets too magical. And there is a danger on that side of the road. I say there's a ditch on either side of this road. I think one problem is if we think about blessing as just kind of a nice thing to say, that doesn't have any power at all. The other problem is if we make it kind of too magical, which is to say, I think we make it like as if it's our power, right? But the key thing about blessing is that it's not our power, it's God's power. And blessing works and blessing has power because God has said that it has power, and God promises that these words are effective, and so ultimately it's a theological criterion and a theological distinction. Sometimes blessing can look like magic, and that's okay, but it's God's magic. That's you see that's the point. That's the difference, I think. Um, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the content of this blessing, which is that the face of God, the Lord, would be able to shine upon us and
Yeah.
bring us peace.
Well, in one sense, these are clearly poetic words, metaphorical words. I don't think we should approach them as if these are scientific terms or something like that. Um, but on the other hand, I think we shouldn't be too quick to kind of push them away as simply being, metaphorical or nice poetic words. I think in a biblical understanding, especially in the context of ancient Israel, these words were probably understood somewhat more literally than we feel comfortable understanding them today. There are many, many verses in the Old Testament about not just God having a face, but the desirability of seeking for God's face, and the possibility of viewing God's face. And actually, there's a debate in the Bible about this, right? I mean, there are texts that talk about people seeing God's face, and they don't always die. And then there are other texts that talk about, not wanting to see God's face because you might die, or something like that. And so I see the biblical tradition as kind of trying to grapple with this notion and seeing different aspects of it over time. And I think you need to kind of get a sense of all of that to get a sense of the shape of this tradition in biblical discourse, in the way people thought about it. But in some traditions of the Old Testament, not only is seeing God's face possible, it's really kind of the goal of the religious life. And I'm struck over and over again by how in Exodus 33, you're working on Exodus right now. Um, there's that language about Moses seeing God face to face, as you do with a friend,
Hmm.
right? And I love that idea. I love the idea that the goal of seeing God's face is to be in relationship with God, to have God as a friend, and that's something of the sense I pick up in the priestly blessing. I mean, a lot of people are familiar uh, with the alternation of the terms. In the traditional translation, it's the Lord's face in the second verse, and it's the Lord's countenance in the third verse. But it's face both times. It's just the same Hebrew word. And in my translation of the book, as the NIV does, I keep that as face both times because I think that emphasis is really important. The priestly blessing finally is an incredibly personal blessing. It's spoken to to a group. It's spoken to all the worshipers, but it uses you singular, and it comes at each person, and it has this emphasis on the Lord's face. And so, as much as it's about the people of Israel, and it is, it's also about every person's relationship with God, um, and what it means for them to be a part of the people of God. Um, in the book, I dig into that a little bit, and I dig into words like grace. How do we understand that in the priestly blessing? This language of lifting up God's face. How might we understand? I suggest maybe a good translation of that would be something like look with favor. Um, and peace, to think again about what peace in the Bible really means. Some of these words, we're so familiar with them. We've heard them a million times and we use them, and we don't always remember that they might have somewhat other nuances and connotations in the Bible. Um, they might actually sometimes have very different meanings. But of course, this is what Bible scholars do. This is how we make a living. So, that's what I'm trying to do too. But not as an end in itself, as a way to really try and help Christians understand their faith better. I found the word keep particularly kind of mystifying. I love the Lord bless you and keep you in the traditional translation. And I'm usually in favor of keeping the traditional language and helping people try and understand it better. But with keep, it just seemed to me that we don't use keep in this way anymore, and that it might be something of a barrier in terms of people trying to understand what the blessing is saying. So I recommended a translation of protect. The Lord bless you and protect you. And, for people who are interested in a three-part sermon with alliteration, I'm a Baptist, I can't help myself. Um, I suggest that one way to think about the priestly blessing in its three parts is that it's about protection, promotion, and peace. Promotion in the sense of God being for us, Christ being for us, right? So it's protection, it's promotion, and it's peace. So there you go. There's your three-point sermon with alliteration.
I'm taking notes. I'm going to use it on my next sermon.
There you go. I think it works. And actually, I had in the second term, I had presence in an earlier draft. I thought, well, protection, presence, peace. And I decided that presence didn't go far enough.
Mm.
It's not just about God being with them. It's about God actively supporting them, right? Actively promoting their interests, their best interests. And so in the end, although promoting is maybe, used in a different sense than people are used to, I thought that was better. Protection, promotion, peace. And it's interesting, the medieval Christian exegetes who worked on the blessing, of course, they saw right away that there are these three phrases, and God is mentioned three times and talked about in slightly different ways. And so, of course, they said, this is also a reflection of the Holy Trinity, which I think is a wonderfully profound interpretation, and is not finally foreign to the text, but picks up on the literary form of the blessing and the shape of the blessing. It absolutely understands it from the standpoint of the Christian faith, um, but for Christian theological interpretation, that's fully appropriate.
You mentioned this idea of the face component of coming face
Yes,
to face with God. And we also see in the story of Moses when he first encountered God in the burning bush, he hid his face. And it
that's
was
right.
only over time of engaging and interacting with God that he gets to that place in chapter 33 where he is face to face with God. And of course, the people were too afraid to even come into the shadow of the mountain of God because of fear of getting close to God. There
That's
is something here That preaches well, doesn't it?
Yes. And here again, I think there's a way of understanding face in too with too much of a kind of sentimental nuance. I mean, the face of God is an awesome, terrible thing. We shouldn't underestimate the sovereignty and the power of God. On the other hand, it's in the biblical tradition, New Testament as well as Old, it is Jesus Christ who finally makes God's face plain to us and allows us to view God's face in a way that finally people in the Old Testament sort of hoped for but could not manage in quite the same sense, within a Christian understanding. It's you know, to use the Trinitarian language for the Bible and for early Christian theologians, the 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 person of Christ is understood to be the revelation of the name of the Father, right? And we could say that about the face of God as well, that Jesus Christ is revelation of the face of God, which is exactly what Paul talks about in Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 4. And so we have this understanding of face. I mean, finally, the face of God is not a metaphor because we saw and see the face of Christ. And the face of Christ reveals the face of God to us. And the face of Christ is not a metaphor.
Hmm. If you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father. I think
There
that's
you
really
go.
significant.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent.
You,
That's the biblical understanding, right?
you mentioned the importance of this. Obviously, it is a central component. It is a linchpin of the Old Testament, of God giving his glory to his people and his
Yeah.
name to his people. But what is its significance for us as New Testament believers? We have Jesus. Why does this matter? We have the blessings in the epistles. Why do we need to dive into the Old Testament to get a blessing for a people that seem very foreign to us?
Yeah. Um, well, it's not a matter of having to do it. I think it's a matter of the fullness and the riches of our faith. Scripture comes to us in two testaments, and the conversation between the two enriches both. I, I really push back against the idea that the Old Testament is merely prologue or background. The Old Testament is scripture, fully scripture. And I think even for those of us who are Christians today, we can learn more about God. We can learn more about Christ. We can learn more about the Holy Spirit when we read the Old Testament as well as the New. And with regard to the priestly blessing, I actually think I try and point this out in the book. There are multiple places in the New Testament where having a knowledge of the priestly blessing and the traditions around it actually helps us understand the New Testament better. You know, in the Lord's Prayer, we pray, "Hallowed be thy name." What are we talking about? What does it mean to say, for us to say, sanctify God's name, make God's name holy? Isn't God's name already holy? What kind of sense does that make? It doesn't seem to make any sense at all. The way for it to make sense is to understand this whole Old Testament tradition uh, in which the name of God is so important and in which members of the people of God are understood to be bearing God's name. And by their words and actions, their lives, their bodies, they're understood to either reflect glory on God and God's name, or sometimes reproach. I mean, for the Old Testament tradition, and this survives in Judaism, what we do as believers reflects on God, reflects on Christ. And so all of that is bound up with this idea of hallowing God's name. The way we hallow God's name, the way we sanctify God's name, is finally by living lives that are honoring to God. Um, I find it very striking in Judaism that God's reputation is sort of understood to be on the line. God's reputation among the nations is understood to be on the line, and we have a role in that. What we say or do affects how people outside the people of God think about God. And, unfortunately, there are a lot of distressing recent examples where Christian leaders and Christian communities have brought shame on the name of God and have sullied God's reputation because of their words and actions. And so it's very important for us to take this to heart.
You mentioned that obviously understanding this Aaronic priestly prayer is crucial, and you kind of touched on the fact that how it kind of brings us an understanding of who we are. You're bringing it into our context, not just leaving it in
Yes.
a context in the historic background. But when
Yes.
we look at the context there, we can see that they were walking through circumstances that are very similar to ours. They were going through some times where they were confused. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't know what their safety would come from. They were insecure. They didn't have a lot to grab onto and say, this is what we have. This is concrete. These are our houses. This is our temple. It was all sort of a mystery, and yet they had these words to guide them through that process.
Absolutely. And one of the things I found fascinating as I got into this was the learning that I did around ancient Jewish worship. I was sort of broadly familiar, but I really dug into the details. And I don't know that I had really fully taken to heart how in the ancient worship service, the ancient service at the temple, the priestly blessing was really the spoken culmination of the service. So the main sacrificial service happened twice a day, the morning and the afternoon. And at the end of the service, which, was largely done by the priests in the temple building itself, the priests would actually come outside and they would stand on the steps of the temple building facing the people who were gathered in the courtyard, and they would pronounce the priestly blessing facing the people. And so this idea about putting the blessing on the people really makes a lot of sense in that kind of context. But I love this idea of the blessing as the culmination, the climax really of the service. Of course, there was the sacrifice itself, and the sources vary a little bit here. It's not fully clear whether the sacrifice happened after the priestly blessing or before it. Might have changed over time. The Bible doesn't specify exactly, but it's clear that the spoken culmination of the service was the priestly blessing. And, I often think about this now when I go to Christian worship services and we get to the end of the service and, the benediction is kind of a throwaway. Sometimes it's not even really a blessing. And I kind of think, we could really recapture something hugely valuable if we thought of blessing as being more robust, if we thought of blessing as being more powerful, as we thought of blessing, not just as some kind of tacked on statement, but as the climax of the service. That's what it was in ancient Israel. Something else I try and advocate for in the book is for blessing to become more robust outside of Christian worship by Christian believers. Something else that's striking to me in the New Testament traditions is very much a sense that blessing is not something that should just be done by clergy, but all Christians. In First Peter 3, uh, blessing is, he says, to this you were called. right? Repay with a blessing. To this you were called. So there's a sense that blessing is really the Christian vocation. Um, and here's where I think blessing is just such a timely concern. I mean, all around us, there are cutting, sarcastic words. All around us, there's violence. And yet the New Testament teaching is love your enemies,
Mm.
not tolerate them, right? Love your enemies, bless those who curse you. I I really want Christians to be people of blessing, right? We should not be people of cursing. We should be people of blessing. And I think it's incumbent upon all Christians today, and not just clergy, to try and find ways of blessing again, blessing in the home, blessing others in our walks of life. It should not only be liturgical. And I think there's a lot of room to have more robust practices of blessing within the church and church life as well. But it shouldn't be limited to that. I mean, to take the New Testament witness seriously would mean to really reclaim blessing for ourselves as a daily Christian practice. There's a rabbinic instruction, a rabbinic word of instruction that encourages Jews to try and utter 100 blessings a day. And I love that. What would it mean to try and utter blessings on a daily basis for Christians? And particularly what I like about that is that, with that kind of blessing ambition, uh, you have to really be thinking about what you might be able to bless and what you might be able to say. You're sort of living your daily life looking for opportunities to bless.
Mhm.
And I would love to see a kind of increase in that way of thinking among Christians and among Christian churches. It changes your outlook on the world, and it changes your vision of your relationship with the world. And I just, I have to say, I think it's just desperately, desperately needed in this time of uh, divisiveness and conflict. Uh, Christians just really need to be people of blessing.
What advice do you have for our listeners, and maybe pastors or ministry leaders or those who are helping in the process of leading worship in their church, on how to use this as a means of providing the structure of that blessing? Because as I like to teach, that the service is meant to be a reflection of what ought to be worked out throughout the rest of the week. So, what sort of instruction, encouragement would you have for those leading and formulating the service on how to include the Aaronic blessing in a meaningful way?
Well, I would say, I think if Christian worship leaders, pastors haven't been using the priestly blessing at all, this is a great time to start. Uh, And I think they will find that it is a word which is really powerful for people, and it is a word that has power. Uh, I would also encourage worship leaders and pastors not only to think about the priestly blessing, whether it's at the conclusion of the service or some other time in the worship service, but to find other opportunities for other kinds of blessing. I think there's so much to be gained by adding blessings of various types to Christian worship. And when we do this, to make them true words of blessing, which is to say, not just nice affirming words again. It it takes a certain kind of conviction and courage, really. It takes a firm sense of vocation, Christian vocation, pastoral vocation, to look at someone and raise a hand and say, I bless you. That can be a hard thing for us to do because we understand that that is a word of power, right? and it introduces a kind of accountability, really. I mean, what happens then? What happens next? What happens if something changes or if something doesn't? It puts us in a whole new kind of territory. But I think we need to take the step. I think we need to sort of reclaim that boldness and become bolder with blessing, especially since, as we've just talked about it, for the New Testament, this is the heart of Christian life, the heart of Christian worship. This is the heart of Christian existence. I'd love to see constructive, creative applications of blessing within Christian worship. Not just save blessing for the closing benediction. I mention a couple of thoughts, a couple of ideas in the book. I think there are times in a Christian worship service, Christian community, we want to acknowledge certain transitions, and we don't always know what to do. I think these could be great times for blessing. You've got some high school kids going off to college. Why not bless them in the worship service? You've got some young people going into military service. Why not bless them? Or what about when they come back? I really have a heart for our veterans because they come back into our society and oftentimes they get very little help. And particularly in the church, we're not very good always in the church about acknowledging life situations and stages among our congregants. And I think that this is an opportunity where we could call upon the tradition of blessing and reintroduce blessings into the service. I'm very confident people would be very grateful for it and that they would find it moving and powerful because that's just what blessings do.
How would you speak to the person who is in attendance of a worship service and participating from, say, the pew in receiving this blessing? What should their mindset be? What should they be focusing in on when they are receiving a blessing like this?
Boy, that's a great question. I do think we're sort of confused about blessings, and the benediction. I often feel like when you get to the end of a blessing service, people don't know what to do. You know, am I just supposed to stand here? Am I supposed to bow my head? Um, I don't think blessings are prayers. In prayers, we're speaking to God and we're speaking in a certain way. It seems to me blessing is quite different. In blessing, it's really God who's speaking to us, and we're sort of pronouncing what God is saying to us. And so I wouldn't really recommend that people adopt a prayer stance to receive a blessing, bowing their heads. I like the idea actually of keeping your eyes open and looking up to the heavens, um, from whence our blessings come, if I can put it that way. Um, a number of people would also recommend opening one's hands while a blessing is said in order to sort of receive the blessing. I like that idea a lot. I think there's room in Christian worship to be more physical. I think some of the Pentecostal traditions have reintroduced this sense of the body and worship to the global church, and I think quite helpfully. We're kind of uncomfortable with physical expression in worship in a large part of the church, and when we're inhibited like that, and I'm speaking as much of myself as anybody else, because it's not always so easy for me. Um, but when we're a little looser physically, when we're a little bit more open physically, we sort of open ourselves up to God, in a new way. And here again, I think blessing can help us do that. So I think worship leaders and pastors could encourage people. Try opening your hands to receive a blessing, and feel the force of the words come over you, and maybe imagine that this word of blessing is coming over you almost like a new set of clothes so that you can wear it when you leave the church and go out into the world.
Hmm. With that being said, could I ask you to pray for our listeners as
Absolutely.
they consider this blessing, which is not a prayer, it's something for them, but to pray with them and over them and to bless them in your words.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'd be glad to. Gracious God, what could we do? Who could we be without you? We rely on you every minute of every day. We ask that you would bless us, clothe us in your blessing, that we might speak words of blessing to others, keep evil words from our mouths, help us through our speech to be agents of upbuilding, speaking words of love and compassion to the world. We ask that you would make us agents of blessing, O Lord, this day and every day. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. We've been talking with Dr. Stephen Chapman, who is the author behind the Lord Bless You, Numbers 6, for the life of the church. It's part of the Touchstone text that he is the editor of. And I can't thank you enough, Stephen. Thank you for your blessing and thank you for your presence here and as a part of the many voices for that one message.
It's been a real pleasure, Adam. Thank you so much.